Well, let's now bring in international relations analyst Professor Gilbert Khadiagala to weigh in on these developments out in Russia. Professor, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Prof, please tell us more about this Wagner group. How did it start?
The Wagner group started around early 2000s when a lot of Russian military were unemployed, but the Russian government also wanted to have a presence abroad. So the private military groups like Wagner became very important as part of Russian foreign policy, beginning to play very important roles as mercenaries in places like Syria, Libya, and currently, in fact, the Wagner group as we speak is in Mali and some West African countries, pushing the interests of Russia, but again, pushing very private interests because this is a private military company that benefits the owners of the company, but also plays a big role in Russian foreign policy. And then in 2014, Wagner Group started playing an important role in Russia itself through the invasion of Ukraine when Crimea was annexed by Russia from Ukraine. And the Wagner Group was the important player in that conflict. So since then, they have played a very important role in Russia's internal politics. And that is why when Putin invaded the Ukraine last year, the Wagner Group was the key player. And it has been playing that role until very recently, when there was a mini civil war between the Wagner Group and the Russian military forces. Wagner Group feels that, in fact, they are not getting the credit for the successes that Russia has made in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But they are also complaining that they are not getting enough weaponry from the Russian government. Mm-hmm. And as we see now, the leader of the group is complaining about the corruption of the Russian military in Moscow. And then yesterday, it came to a head when the Wagner Group now claims it was attacked in Ukraine by the Russian military. Mm-hmm. So it has been a series of events, this love-hate relationship between the Russian military and the Wagner Group, particularly in the war in Ukraine. So as the war is now getting to a very, very decisive point, the Wagner Group probably is having second thoughts. So we don't really know whether it was attacked by the Russian military in Ukraine, and that's why they have sparked the rebellion. Mm-hmm. That's why they have left some parts of Ukraine now. They are moving to Moscow because they are claiming they want to go and liberate Russia from the corrupt military that Mr. Putin is using. So it's a very dicey situation. Mm-hmm. But I think the short story of it is that Wagner has been a player in the war in Ukraine, but it has been an autonomous player of sorts, autonomous from the military that Putin has put in Ukraine. And now this mini civil war is what may potentially lead to a bigger civil war within Russia itself, because Putin has now declared war on the Wagner Group, because the Wagner Group to him is they are treasoners, they are rebels, and they want to destroy the Russian state.
Let's go back now to Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, who's on Zoom with us. Professor, I mean, judging from what, of course, our correspondent is saying, that based on the reports that they're receiving, it seems like there's really tensions on the ground in Russia.
No, definitely there are tensions on the ground, and this started last night, so it couldn't have been going on, these reports couldn't have been going on without some validity. And I think the worrying issue here is that if, as the Wagner Group says, the Russian troops attacked it in Ukraine, that means the Russian regime has lost confidence in the Wagner Group. And therefore, this is going to be an all-out war, because the Wagner Group is not it's a very strong force. I mean, it has played the most important role in Ukraine and the capture of the eastern parts of Ukraine. So it's important that the reports be taken seriously, that the Wagner Group may be trying now to see whether they can recapture Moscow. On the other hand, maybe the Wagner group could be overplaying its hand, because maybe the way Putin can survive is simply to say, let's wait for them and see whether they will come to Moscow. And I think we had a report that there have been trenches being built around Moscow. Maybe that's why the Putin regime could actually just simply wait for them to come and destroy them. But it's hard to know. They already have some ground, they have made some ground in the southern parts of Russia where borders with Ukraine, and therefore that has importance for Ukraine. Maybe the Ukrainians can remobilize and maybe get rid of the invaders, but we really don't know whether the reports about the Wagner group taking over big military districts in the south of Russia is actually credible. But this would be the beginning, therefore, of Ukraine beginning to regain its territory, if that is correct. But also that depends on what is happening in Moscow, because if there is more remobilization, maybe if Putin can pull the country together, who knows? The Wagner group may not be as critical in this case as it is now, because it will be ranged against the entire Russian nation. And I think we've had reports like the Chechens who are fighting with the Russians for many years have now come up, and they are saying they are going to send their troops to support Putin and so on. So the more Putin regains his standing militarily, the better it is for him. But if he loses that, that means the Wagner group will be more emboldened to seize more territory. And therefore we have really a very dicey situation in Russia at the moment.
Well, Prof, what do you make of the timing of all of this? I mean, of course, the Russian president is currently embroiled in, of course, in that ICC arrest warrant that has caused a whole lot of controversy over breaks. I mean, the world has been watching what South Africa is going to do. What do you make of this development, particularly at this time, and I mean, during these developments?
I think the timing is interesting because you remember that the African presidents were in Moscow and Kiev last week trying to mediate a peaceful solution to this problem. But the other issue was that the Ukrainians were trying to, in fact, to do a counteroffensive. That means remobilize and fight the Russians who are invaded their territories. So the confluence of those two events, I think, is important. The hand for a peaceful solution looked very serious from last week when Putin, in fact, said he was ready to negotiate with Zelensky. But with the Ukrainians beginning, therefore, to remobilize and do a counteroffensive, this is not going to work very well for Russia because it would reveal that there are big, big weaknesses within the Russian military. And therefore, that is a very bad sign for Russia if it wants to win that war militarily. But on the other hand, it could be a good sign for Ukraine because a weaker Russia militarily would potentially be willing to negotiate a peaceful settlement. So I see that anytime there is weaknesses in Moscow, particularly militarily, it strengthens the hands of the African presidents who are talking about this war needs to end. But this war cannot end without Russia essentially coming up and saying we need to negotiate honestly with the Ukrainians. So it's an important event because the weaker Russia gets, the better the chances for a negotiated settlement to this conflict. On the other hand, if Russia now begins to get stronger and stronger, then the chances of a negotiated settlement are going to be not to be on the horizon. But if Russia is getting weaker militarily, if there is a sign of a civil conflict in Russia, it may be a good chance for Putin to come back to his friends and say, I think I'm ready to negotiate with the Ukrainians. So how can we then begin to look at what the Africans were saying when they were in town last weekend?
Professor, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insight. That is international relations analyst Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, also weighing in on the Russia impasse.